Morning. Rowdy crowd. Yes. Can you hear me okay, everyone? Yes? All right, great. Let's get started then. Welcome to the 13th year of Coffee and Conversation. 13th, yes, 13. And it's a very sluggy day out there. The slugs are on my walk to work today. I must have came across 1,000 slugs. But maybe more interestingly, this is something that the College of the Atlantic gives back to the Mount Desert Island community in exchange for making our lives and experience possible here at the College of the Atlantic. For the next 7 weeks, actually, that's not true, for 7 Tuesdays at 9:30, we will have this coffee and conversation, save for August 1st, which is a Tuesday when we'll be under the tent, and you're all welcome to come to that. That, of course, is our Tuesday where we'll be in the middle of our COA Summer Institute. And so I think there's something really special about getting together, right? Especially after the COVID years, and especially when you bring two people together in conversation that's somewhat scripted, but really a lot crazy can happen.
Unscripted.
Or unscripted, even better. But more importantly, when you bring two people together who have range, right? If I had two people who are very narrowly focused, there's only so much that can come out of that. And Susan Letcher, I'm going to introduce, has loads and loads of range. She is the Newland Chair in Botany here at the College of the Atlantic, the Elizabeth Battles Newland Chair. She's been with us since 2017. She did her undergraduate degree at Carleton College, her PhD at University of Connecticut, was with OTS, the Organization for Tropical Studies, and then a faculty member at SUNY Purchase before she came here. Her research and teaching is on the neotropical forests, the relationship between plants with themselves and with people. She's an eminent human ecologist, widely published, but she's also a musician and a mom, which is two big things, right? I don't know, I saw Willow earlier. There's Willow right there, right? Yeah. A musician and a mom. She's a wonderful teacher, but she's also a second-degree black belt in Taekwondo. Right?
Oh, yes.
And she has a different name. Sometimes she goes by Susan, sometimes she goes by Isis.
No,
Jackrabbit.
Jackrabbit. Isis is the
Isis
sister.
is here today, though.
Is she? Oh, good,
She's
good,
here.
good. Where? Oh, there's Isis. Sorry.
Love your book.
Okay, all right. So, but she's yo-yoed the Appalachian Trail, which means she's walked south and north and done it barefoot. And so all of those things together make Susan a very, very rangy faculty member. And of course, we're super excited that she's in conversation with our good friend, Kim Stanley Robinson, who goes by Stan. So it's all yours. Right.
Darren,
Thank
thank
you,
you
Darren.
so much for that wonderful introduction. And it's really my pleasure to be talking today with Stan Robinson. He's described in a recent New Yorker profile as one of our greatest living writers of speculative fiction, which I 100% agree with. Marvelous. Excuse me. He's written over 20 novels and several books of nonfiction. He's won every major award in his field, many times, multiple times over. He has a PhD in English from UC San Diego and working with the well-known Marxist critic Frederick Jameson. He has been named as a hero for the environment. He was a featured speaker at the COP26, the Conference of the Parties of the Paris Agreement. He's probably the book that put him on the map as a science fiction author is the Mars trilogy, which many of you may be familiar with. But in recent years, he's turned towards a genre that's been called Sci-fi, climate fiction, dealing with the near future of Earth and how humanity will confront the climate crisis or fail to confront it, with books that have enormous optimism, range, books that are harrowing, but also just heartening and so human and humane. Stan is also an avid hiker. His most recent nonfiction book is called The High Sierra, A Love Story. And if you haven't had a chance to see it, it's a beautiful book and full of marvelous stories and hiking advice that I hope to sometime take. His most recent fiction book is The Ministry for the Future, which I hope, if you have not read that book, if you read one book this year, let that be it, and let those ideas and that spirit of that book carry you. So Stan, I'm so delighted to be here today talking with you. I wanted to start off thinking about your vision of the future. As a writer of speculative fiction, that's kind of what you're tasked with, is communicating your vision of the future. And I'm wondering how that vision has changed over your writing career.
Yikes.
Unscripted.
Well, yeah, unscripted indeed. I grew up in Southern California, and when I was a kid, it was agricultural. It was orchards, really, orange groves. So I was in the orange groves, and I basically made a mistake thinking that that was what life was like. And the orange groves were torn out and replaced by the city that is Los Angeles, although we were in Orange County. So during my childhood and youth, I saw an agrarian landscape turn into a city right in front of my eyes. And so when I went down to UC San Diego, I encountered science fiction more or less by accident in the libraries, and I became a science fiction writer. So that's a long time ago. And then I guess you could say science fiction is about the impact of technology in our lives. It's a story set in the future. So stories set in the future, all of them are science fiction stories. Even if it's tomorrow, that's a science fiction story. Or if it's 5 million years from now, that's a science fiction story. That's a big stretch of time. So you get different kinds of fiction out of it. And people think of science fiction typically as being in the far future, zipping around the galaxy. It's a kind of a fantasy space. So Star Wars, Star Trek, these are sometimes inside the field called space opera, from horse opera, where there were genres of all kinds. But there was always near future science fiction also, Day After Tomorrow, a kind of a surrealistic view of the present by pushing a few features and pretending that 5 years from now, it's usually left indefinite how far in the future, but Day After Tomorrow, things will be like now, but with some features pushed, kind of surrealism. So science fiction is like those glasses that they used to give you for 3D movies back when 3D movies were a thing. The two lenses show you different things. One lens, you really are trying to think about the future. The other lens is a metaphor for the way things feel right now. And if you can make those two different visions come together in your head, you get a false fourth dimension that pops, which is simply a sense of the future as being real and you can see it. So this is the aesthetic effect of science fiction. And it's powerful if you can make it work. Now, like with those glasses, some people put them on and they just get a headache. They can't make the two images come together. And they go, I cannot tell you how many times people have come up to me and said, well, I never read science fiction in my life. Well, okay, you know, what can I say to that? But if it works for you, it works very well. So near future science fiction, I've played both games. I've set stories. Well, for me, a long time in the future is like 1,000 years. 5 million years, forget about it. But 1,000 years is very hard to imagine. Very hard, maybe impossible. 5 years from now, that's also hard, but it's a different kind of story. So more and more, I've been doing near future science fiction because the stories are there and it's very intense and it's very relevant to the world we're in. Things are changing so fast that if you write a near future science fiction story, like take Ministry for the Future, I wrote it in 2019. It's already way out of date in several important respects. So near future science fiction is a strange kind of way of approaching the present. and trying to talk about now without becoming an instant historical novel, but giving you a little sense of the direction we're going in. And because of the overdetermining effect of climate change on everything, climate change and biodiversity loss, the twin crisis or the poly crisis. Well, if you're going to write near future science fiction, you end up writing climate fiction almost necessarily. And that's happened to me over maybe the last 20 years. It was quite intense.
It seems like one of the things that brings that sort of fourth dimension that you speak of, that sense of reality that draws you into a book, is what you refer to it in Ministry for the Future to Raymond Williams' idea of structures of feeling. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit and how you bring that to life in your work.
Well, I certainly would try to. Raymond Williams was a great British literary theorist, a Marxist critic, and a social commentator of the maybe 1970s. And he had a couple of ideas that have stuck around as ways to comprehend the culture that you're in. One of them, the residual and the emergent, that at any moment in time, like now, there are residual elements that go right back into the Paleolithic, and there are emergent elements that are the future showing up in the present. So this mix of the residual and the emergent, and he was always very clear, it's not like the residual is bad and the emergent is good. And it's not like the residual was good and the emergent is bad. That it's not how it splits out. It's more, when you look at the moment, some things have been here for most of human history, and they persist, including institutions. And then other things are just coming into being, and they might last or they might go away. It's hard to tell. And then the other concept is a structure of feeling. And I think this is one's paradigm, worldview, zeitgeist, the general intellect, common sense. A culture has a structure of feeling. So we all have basic biological emotions. Love, fear, anger, envy. These are biological in origin, and we all feel them. But by way of language and the culture you're brought up in, they mean different things at different times in history to different cultures. Love is a classic example. Romantic love of the Middle Ages is nothing like love in, I don't know, ancient China or in current times. Romantic love is a kind of a cultural concept, etc. So these are all put together into a structure of feeling of your time, and that changes over time. So, I mean, at my age, what things felt like world itself in the 1970s, I don't think that's the same structure of feeling that we're in now. And there was almost a kind of a door slam in the face of young hippies like myself when 1980 hit, when Thatcher and Reagan came into office. There was a kind of a slammed door in the face to the sense of craziness and liberation of the 60s and 70s, and suddenly you're in the 80s. So structures of feeling can change on a dime, although there's probably underlying forces, that Williams would say this, that determine. So it's not quite base superstructure in some vulgar Marxist way. It's more an interactive, dynamic dialectic between how we organize the economy and also the technological base, the infrastructure, how all that works, and then how we think about it. And that thinking is social. We do it together. And we're in here's what I want to finish with on this. The structure of feeling of the neoliberal period, 1980 to 2020, it's very neatly demarcated. The neoliberal period has died, but the next one has not been born. We are in an interregnum of a state of confusion of how to organize our thoughts, and our structure of feeling for the 2020s and the 2030s is in the process of being created by a whole bunch of stuff happening right now. But the neoliberal structure of feeling is, because it was so bad in so many ways, so unjust and so destructive of the environment, it's pretty much a goner, but we don't know how to replace it. And some people would flatly deny what I just said. So it's an interesting time we're in.
And in Ministry for the Future, you describe a similar transition point in the 2040s, 2050s, this kind of inflection point at maximum confusion. And you describe it as, I think, simultaneously falling apart and deeply entrenched. And for me, and I think for many people right now, that feels like a very apt description of our present moment. And so ministry came as such a balm to my spirit, I have to say. And I think for many people, as a vision of how that structure of feeling could change. And some people have described your fiction as being utopian. Bill McKibben, for instance, has vehemently argued that it's anti-dystopian instead. And I wonder if we could talk a little bit about utopia and whether you see that utopian, whether you see that descriptor as useful for understanding your work, or whether you would also push back against that descriptor of utopian.
Oh, well, I thank you for that, because I am a utopian science fiction writer. There aren't very many of us. It's a thin tradition in the literature going all the way back to Sir Thomas More, but it's always been worth doing. Well, and remind me to say something about ministry and the dates in it. But first, Utopia. There's a structural problem with Utopia that starts with Sir Thomas More, in that in most utopian literature, those people get a fresh start and they get the planet from scratch. It's called the Great Trench in More's Utopia, where they were a peninsula. It's like the opposite of Northern Neck. They were a peninsula, but then they cut the causeway and made themselves an island so that they have a fresh start in history. And the Great Trench exists in most utopian fiction. In Le Guin's The Dispossessed, which is the great utopian novel of the 20th century, or maybe of all utopian novels ever, The Dispossessed, Ursula Le Guin, they go to a habitable moon of the main planet, and they get to start fresh with new ideas. Well, we're not going to get that opportunity. And so utopian literature is a kind of a thought experiment. You put it out there, you study it, you go, yeah, that would be great. If things work like that, if we could get a system like that, everybody would be happier. How nice. But we're stuck in this world. So what's the point? And so I've written utopian novels set on Mars, in Antarctica, in an alternative history where all the Europeans died in the plague. In other words, all kinds of trenches of various sorts, and always the utopia is somewhere else, and especially in the far future. And so with ministry, I decided we need to start it now. And in fact, this is actually true of my Washington, D.C. trilogy and of earlier utopian efforts of mine. Could it be a name for a dynamic process of history where things are getting better? And if that's happening in the history that you describe, the future to describe, things are better than now, they're improving, that's utopia. And H.G. Wells was very good on this. That was his definition of utopia, a dynamic positive history going forward, a progressive history, you might say, was a utopian fiction. But with ministry, I decided to start right now with all the problems we have and no trenches, no get out of jail free cards or any kind of thing like that. Just a best case scenario from right now. And right now is such a dark space that what I'm saying is that the bar for utopia has gotten very low. If we survive the 21st century without a mass extinction event, then that's utopia. Cool. So that's what I've been writing. And then lastly, about Ministry for the Future, those dates in that novel are shockingly wrong. I wrote it in 2019. It was a darker time than now by a considerable amount. Nobody seemed to be taking climate change seriously. Trump was still president and could easily have won again. And there was such a dragging of feet on the climate issue that I wrote sentences like the 2030s were zombie years. Well, it looks ridiculous to me now to read those sentences in a book that I wrote just 4 years ago, or maybe 5 now, because the 2030s are going to be electrified. Essentially, the pandemic blasted us into a different future where we realize the planet matters and that our lives are completely contingent on things that can happen that are biological and biospheric and social. And suddenly your whole life can be, shuttered down. And if there was ever a food scare, like there was a toilet paper scare, then it would be intense and things would immediately, civilization would be shattered and dysfunctional. So now we have that feeling. And so in 2023, essentially much of what I wrote about in Ministry for the Future happening in the 2040s, 2050s, it's going to happen in this decade. Things have been accelerated. And this is actually good.
I think that acceleration is it's another important source for hope, really. This idea that ministry provides in some ways a blueprint for the kind of just transition that we need. And the thing that made it feel so compelling and so helpful to me in that time of upheaval was just the vision, having a vision of how things could improve without the trenches and without the gaps. And I think I don't know if you're familiar with Eduardo Galeano's definition of utopia. He's an Uruguayan journalist. He has this wonderful short poem that essentially says, utopia is on the horizon, and I take 2 steps and it retreats 2 steps. I take 10 steps and it runs away 10 steps more. So what good is utopia for? Well, it's good for walking. ¿Para qué sirve la utopía? Sirve para caminar. And so I think books like Ministry can serve that same purpose and give us something to walk towards, as well as perhaps a bit of a path that we might be walking towards. And you've said in some interviews that you actually feel more hopeful now about our collective future than when you wrote Ministry. And I think you've outlined some of the reasons for that. But I wonder if you could talk about some of the specific actions that you've seen or transformations that you've seen that give you more hope now than when Ministry was written.
Sure, it's a long list. The Biden administration has been amazingly good on climate, better than any American administration in history, including the previous recent Democratic ones. So, and there was no obvious sign that would happen. That wasn't the kind of politician that he was. But when he got elected, I think he decided he would be, why not be FDR? Because what did he have to lose at that point? An old man, the end of his career, suddenly he's president. Yes, I'm going to be FDR. And he hired a whole lot of smart young people. So his age is irrelevant because he's hired a team that when you say Joe Biden, you mean about 3,000 people. And about 2,500 of them are around 40 years old, and they know what they're doing, and they've been hired on that basis. I've met about 25 of them, probably, and so only a fraction, but I'm impressed. And so the person making the choices at the top, let's hire these kinds of people, have gotten this kind of result. The biggest climate bill in history by a long shot, this IRA bill, and it goes on and on like that. We have the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund have been spurred on by people like the Prime Minister of France, who seems like a neoliberal jerk of the first order, and yet he's saying, look, we actually have to save the world here, and has gathered and inspired the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and many of the G7 governments, the central banks, to think about a carbon coin like in Ministry for the Future. The World Trade Organization is run by a Nigerian woman who was the finance minister of Nigeria twice, and she's come in saying we need a just transition. Trade itself has to be just and sustainable. Let's change the WTO rules, which I find startling. I could go on if I could remember them. The number of things that is happening. This is the sign of the interregnum of the period of confusion. We actually do need to save the biosphere so that civilization will function, because we rest on it. It is our support system. It's our body, our extended body. We have to take care of it. And that realization, partly the pandemic, partly all the climate disasters already happening, is causing a massive amount of discussion and plans and promises. And so the Paris Agreement and the talks, each one of these COP meetings is a big psychodrama, but also they're under orders by the original charter of the Paris Agreement to up their promises every year. And this is also a total consensus system. So the Paris Agreement has to be voted yes on by everybody. True consensus is bizarre and unnatural in political affairs, because if one person says no, the whole thing falls apart. They were going to phase out coal after the Glasgow meeting that I was at, and India and China raised their hands and said, sorry, we cannot phase out coal. So we're not going to vote for the whole thing. Glasgow fell apart. They went into overtime. They all met in a room. They argued for like 4 or 5 hours, and everybody lost their flights home because the meeting was supposedly over. And they said, okay, we're going to phase down coal. India and China said, okay, we'll agree to that. And so this is how the Paris Agreement works. And so it's one brick in a wall of solutions, but they're all lying on the ground right now, and we don't have a coherent sense of the way forward right now. But so many things are happening that were not happening when I wrote Ministry for the Future, that it's quite startling. And you know, they talk about the Great Acceleration. Since World War II, the sociologists, social science in general, will talk about the Great Acceleration in capital letters. Everything that we measure about human activity has accelerated since World War II in an accelerating way. But within the Great Acceleration, I'm going to say there were 3 or 5 year periods where things jump, and there's an acceleration within the acceleration. And 2020 to 2022 was a massive acceleration of all kinds of things. So now we're going at speed, but we don't really know where. And a lot of this is promises that haven't yet been acted on or paid. So we are in a period of turmoil.
It's a challenging moment, certainly. The climate scientist Kurt Steger has likened it. His metaphor for our current moment is we have just woken up at the wheel of a large truck going the wrong way on a superhighway. And we can turn the wheel and go on the off ramp, or we cannot. And that really, I mean, it really is a moment of polycrisis. And one of the things that sometimes makes me hopeful when I reach for optimism in polycrisis is that there are so many ways to attack the polycrisis that almost every day there are actions we can take, and almost every moment there are actions we can take to make things a little better in certain ways. And
thinking of that metaphor, you have to realize that there's a guy in the passenger seat that is grabbing the wheel saying, we don't have to change a thing. And if we die, I'm going to heaven and you're not. And so I want this crash. I want this crash. And so we're going to have to change the steering wheel, fighting other people trying to turn the other way. So it's even more wicked than, oh my God.
Yeah. And you know, I think that's where utopian fiction can come in and say, okay, here's why we should be turning the steering wheel this way. International finance ministers and bankers and oil companies. And you know, one of the things that struck me in ministry was the ways that the solutions come from everywhere. And it reminded me of the 2014 climate march in New York. At the time I was living close enough, I could just take the train down there, and it was amazing to be among so many people talking about solutions to climate change. And the slogan of that march, they said, to change everything, we need everyone. And I think that sense of everyone getting on board, some eventually reluctantly compelled in various ways, but everyone eventually realizing, yeah, we have a crisis. We need to save enough of the biosphere so that our human society can continue to function. I think that realization is really hitting people a lot faster and harder than it was, you know, even in 2019, as you say. And I think part of that is coming from novels like Ministry. One other thing I wanted to talk about a little bit in your fiction and in Ministry particularly is the idea of scientists, and science is kind of a utopian community. And it's something that, you know, as a scientist, I find very flattering when I read your work. You often hold up scientists as kind of a group of people dedicated to understanding things, to kind of responsibly managing things. And I wonder if you could talk about kind of science and scientists as a utopian community.
My pleasure, really. I'm a big fan. I am a fan of science. It sounds silly, but I am an English major and a science fiction writer. I write novels. I'm not a scientist myself. Married to a scientist, I watched a scientist at work and thinking. It's a pretty hilarious process to watch, and beautiful. And I do think science is a praxis. Okay, it is theory and practice combined in the world. I think it was an attempt by certain humans to say, look, we can't control the political process. We're not in control of the money, but let's do what good we can right now with what we got. And it often began, I think, in medicine. Can we make people healthier? So then it's trial and error and paying attention and keeping records. And the scientific method is relatively straightforward and obvious once you, the basic elements of it are known to all and easy to pursue, but it is a kind of a utopian politics in action. So this is what praxis is in a tradition I come out of. It's we've got a theory, but the theory has to be enacted in the world, or else it's just ideas and talk. And what we really want is results. So the praxis of science I've always loved. Let's do things. And where can we exert power in the world to make humans more comfortable and less in pain, and follow those lines? So what's not to like? We are all living a life that is completely transformed, let's say, by the scientific successes of the last 4 centuries. So we live in a scientific world, and the current challenges to science from the right are arguments over power and politics. And it's also, it strikes me as intensely hypocritical, because these people, the moment that they get sick, feel bad, are scared for their lives, they run to a scientist, which is their doctor. And so really what we need to do is spread throughout this whole political community that we're in. You too believe in science, because when you break your arm or when you're in fear for your life, and one example I like to use, a person will say to you, you're sick and you're going to die in a couple of years if you don't let us poison you. You have no symptoms. You say, okay, poison me to within an inch of my life, and maybe I will live. You are putting a lot of trust in that person. At that point, you're asymptomatic, and yet most people say, give me the chemo, I hope it works. And the person telling you say, well, might not work, have to tell you, this is a game that we're in that we don't have all the answers to. And still, you trust the scientist. So all challenges to science in this world today of every person living are hypocritical at best, or ignorant and deluded, not getting it. And so the word should be spread on that basis. Science is a power in the world that we all depend on, and it's doing a lot of good for us. It creates accidental side effects. Suddenly there's 8 billion humans instead of 1 billion because of scientific success. And now we've got all kinds of ancillary problems from that. But so again, this is the same thing with utopia, same thing with science. It is not magic. And that too has to be clarified. It's great, it's doing wonderful things, it's not magic, it's not going to save you if you're sick enough, etc. So this is the kind of story I like to tell about the sciences.
Well, I think many scientists are fans of yours as well.
Yes,
the
I've
Mutual
noticed that.
Admiration Society.
And now the UN is a fan of me now. I wonder why. I mean, this Ministry for the Future saying that the diplomatic corps of the world could actually help, and their efforts would not be in vain. It makes that book very popular amongst a certain segment of society.
Let's see. I want to talk about hope and optimism in the last few minutes, because I think we live in a time where we need a lot of that. And I think your books are a useful source of that. But I think one of the things that comes across for me reading your books is an almost parental sense of responsibility in the ways that you write about things. When you read something in the space opera genre, where it's sort of like, people shooting lasers at things and having adventures in space, there's sort of an escapist thing. But when I read your novels, I find myself so deeply drawn to the characters and the scenarios, because I think this is real life. These are people who I care about. And especially in ministry, this is a planet and a biosphere that I care about. And I wonder, I read in an interview that you wrote many parts of your Mars trilogy when you were a stay-at-home dad, essentially writing during nap times. And I wonder how that sense of parenthood, how that sense of kind of responsibility and collective responsibility towards the next generation, how and if parenthood has shaped your writing.
Well, I am a Mr. Mom in that my wife, a very hardworking scientist, was gone 12 hours a day, 5 days a week, and sometimes 6 or 7 from the age of our older son when he was 10 weeks old. I was given that responsibility in complete ignorance. Wow. And it was easily the 2 of the most beautiful years of my life, the intensity of that, of a daily care for an infant and toddler. Well, to a certain extent, I think moms keep it kind of under the radar because it's such a great part of life that why would you want to share it with the foolish men that would come in and wreck things or it's so absorbing and so much fun that nothing else is as interesting anyway. But you don't need to broadcast that to the world because it's kind of a sisterhood of moms. And often I would ruin the party by being the only guy in the room, the only dad in a room of 30 moms. This is not a good situation for anybody. So I saw it, I lived it. It was great. It passes fast, as every parent knows, and then you're on to a different phase. But yeah, it taught me things. It taught me to write fast. And it taught me to think about the generations to come, the intensity of care. If you could generalize that sensation from your own kids to the other future generations, this would be very good for them. I mean, essentially we live now in a Ponzi scheme where somebody is going to be left holding the bag and their lives will be ruined by the illicit get rich quick schemes of the people running the Ponzi scheme, which is the current generation. If it's multi-generational, a certain class of people running a Ponzi scheme on the rest of humanity. You've got to, if you think about it as wrecking your children's lives, then you try to eradicate the Ponzi scheme. So I do think it matters. And it's, there are great far future novels. The novel can take on any material. And if the novel is good, the novel is good. So a space opera by Ian Banks is a superb fantasy by, the great fantasy writers, or Tolkien or George MacDonald or whatever. There can be great novels in any genre. But the near future science fiction novel I've been saying is the realism of our time. It is the thing that the realist novel was doing from the beginning of the novel through the modernist period of describing the way things are now and making sense of your society to yourself. That was what the novel was for. And one of the things that I'm enjoying about the success of Ministry is just what it says about the novel. It can still work. If you don't just focus in on the individual psychodramas of a couple characters in relation to each other, if you write about characters in relation to their neighbors and their society and their planet, the novel still has that power. And so you talked about hope. It's actually scary to see how popular Ministry has been, because if people are out in the ocean drowning and a crappy little life raft or life ring comes floating by, they will grab onto it because there's nothing else and it keeps them going. So it's been a little frightening to see people grab hold of Ministry because it means that there isn't a good rescue ship coming by. They are just grabbing for hope, like, oh, you mean we could make it work? There's a story here that seems to suggest that we could get through this century without a mass extinction event. And there's an intensity to the grabbing hold of this book that I have found actually frightening. There needs to be more stuff like that.
Yeah, I think we need more life rafts, and perhaps life rafts that are built by scientists, by UN politicians, by oil companies transformed into energy companies, by international bankers transformed into economic justice structures. We need to translate this vision of utopia into the actual everyday hard work utopia that we're building, that I hope we're building for the
Yeah.
sake of our future, our collective future.
The all hands on deck, that everybody, or at least a working political majority, we need a working political majority to make these things happen. Yes, and it's true though, again, it comes back to a structure of feeling. If the general intellect of our time, if the structure of feeling of the 2020s is, okay, we got a crisis, but that means there's a meaning to life because we all have to do something that will help to solve the crisis. So suddenly life has a purpose, and that's part of a structure of feeling too, especially for the students who are here. Then that will be, this is a different way of talking about it than just hope as an individual psychological condition. I like to shift it to more social and even biological. Like when you're hungry, that hunger is a hope. I hope I get food. So your cells, bacteria have hope. Everything alive has hope as a kind of a, could I please live on? And so hope is, I like to generalize it out and not make it just a kind of a psychological standpoint that you supposedly could choose or not choose. Like, oh, I'm really a pessimist about this, or I don't want to have hope because later I'll be disappointed because my hopes are always disappointed. The psychological aspects of it are not as interesting as the social and biological aspects of it. I mean, we just got to do this stuff for the children, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and for me, that sense of hope as a moral necessity and as a bedrock to our lives, I don't think I fully understood that until I became a parent. And I think that is the kind of attitude that perhaps we need to take collectively towards the biosphere, thinking about the biosphere, future generations with that same sense of hope as a bedrock moral necessity that we bring to raising our children. And I think that level of responsibility, it's a heavy responsibility to take on, to think about our future in this parental way. But I think, that's where we need to go. The other thing that I would say is, coming from your books and certainly from my life experiences, we also need to go outside. You got to get out and experience these amazing landscapes, the biosphere, the other creatures who inhabit it. And that can really feed this sense of hope and optimism and commitment towards working towards hope and towards change.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because we've got a serious hiker here.
And here as well.
Yeah, and I have loved it. It's very important. Walking puts you in a different relationship to space, to the planet, to your own. It's a different thinking process. It slows you down. It makes you pay attention to your surround. And the planet is beautiful. I mean, not just this island, although this island is incredibly beautiful, but every place is interesting and more interesting than looking at your computer screen. I try to emphasize this to students today, and many of them are like, I don't know even what you're talking about, because the structure of feeling of their time is incredibly mediated by the internet and by screens. Dive into a screen, never come out until it's time to go to sleep. Well, this is a very much diminished life as an animal. And since we are animals, these people are messed up. So again, the structure of feeling needs to include the idea that we are animals on a planet. And so, and walking, it's transformative. We evolved to walk. And when you walk, you can feel that. Like parts of your brain that aren't usually active when you're sitting and you're doing desk work, which I've done a zillion hours of. But when you start walking, there are parts of your brain going, oh yeah, I was built to do this, and I'm better at it than you thought I was.
Oh, thank you so much, Stan. It's really been such a pleasure talking with you. I hope everyone will get outside and do some walking later today when the sun comes out a little more. It's really been a joy to talk with you today. I think at this point, we're going to open it up to some audience questions. Sean will be circulating with the microphone so that we have good sound quality.
Mic levels here.
Thank
right.
you all for being here today. And Stan, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Susan. Yeah, interested to hear questions.
And I'll just make note that to speak into the mic so that the folks who are watching virtually can hear as well.
Stan, if you were sitting in this place 100 years ago, the science would have been very different. It would have been the reign of the eugenicists and those who said the future was really tied up in racial differences. How do you think about the impact of that thinking in terms of what we have to deal with today?
Well, that is one of several moments in the history of science where the scientists of a particular generation got wildly overconfident that they had all the answers. Because they began to get some grasp on the world by way of science, and they began to understand some things, that it made the very common error of thinking that meant that they could understand all things, and that their power was so much more advanced over any previous human power that they had the method, they had the answers. And so you get scientific racism of the late 19th century, that you could actually say things about human beings that were unsupported, and they fall into the realm of bad science, essentially not paying enough attention to the evidence and making hypotheses without testing them. The post-war, in World War II, the scientists won World War II between penicillin, radar, and the atom bomb. The war was won by mostly men, 95% men in white coats, wearing thick glasses, and they appeared to be wizards. Oh, we can solve this disease. Oh, we can see things through the dark, and and we can blow up an entire city. Whoa, this is all new and came in about a 5 or 10 year period. And at the end of World War II, the whole world was looking at the scientists going, what are you going to do next? And it could be bad, but it might be good. And the scientists went out of their minds for a while. So you had sprayed DDT on the streets to get rid of mosquitoes, and you had thalidomide babies, and you had all kinds of crazy scientific excess. It wasn't the first time, because as you point out, there was the eugenics of 100 years ago, and there was Spencer, the immediate post-Darwinists. If it's survival of the fittest, then you got to kill somebody, or else you're not fitter than they are. So misunderstandings, science going too far, the arrogance of it, and being a priest caste for a while, that has happened. But the interesting thing about the scientific method is scientists get together in their committees, their conferences, their associations. My wife is a member of the Society for Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry. Right now, she and her colleagues are setting standards for how to set standards, which I find hilarious. Very meta, very beautiful. But the scientific method is sort of like the Paris Agreement. It's in a constant state of self-evaluation and attempting to improve itself so that next time around you don't do the stupid thing, and brakes are put on. Right now, the American Geophysical Union has become a major force in the sciences to try to make more justice, more diversity, more inclusion, more feminist. And this is geophysicists were, again, 90% male just a generation ago. Now it's almost 50-50, and there's intense drive to make science more open to the public, more comprehensible, and more actionable by everybody. So it's just like the utopian drive in anything else. So it's an iterative process, and occasionally we see in history these moments. Oh my God, we can do anything. Let's bomb. Let's create the Panama Canal by atomic bombs, or some of the plans of the past. And this is why there's a deep fear of geoengineering. There are some scientists saying, look, we could just cast some dust in the sky and temperatures will be 5 degrees lower for 5 years. Where's the problem in that? And people are thinking atomic bomb, thalidomide, eugenics, we do not want to mess with the Earth system. But since we already have messed with the Earth system, that argument is extremely conflicting. So this is how I see science as working. And as a science fiction writer, as a fan of science, I just say that it's not the answer to everything. You need ethics, you need philosophy. There's one thing about science I like a lot. It has a certain modesty. When it's going right, it says, don't ask us why to do things, or don't even ask us what. We give you some tools. This is how you would do it if you wanted to. What do you want to do? And science will usually say, That's civil society's problem to decide. I'm just a scientist. I want to study my botany problems. I want to find out if turtles are 50 million years old or 70 million years old. Please don't make me try to decide what society should be. So this relationship of science to society is something you've got to really constantly interrogate and think about.
Just following up on that question, do you have any concerns about science now being co-opted? I'm thinking, the 97% consensus from the discussion here, it's all foundational. Climate crisis is real, and that's by scientists. Do you have any concern that, much like the eugenicists, and I don't think it was the scientists and eugenics, it was politics and power that, that leverage that. But in any of these things, the good and the bad, it's exercise of the power. Right now, I have a concern that there's power is canceling. Is that really so? And that's, get with the program. That's a concern, and it's sort of overreactions. And I have a concern that our society now, like you said, when you wrote Ministry of the Future, no one was getting any of it. We were just oblivious. We've definitely, societies around the world have changed. What are your thoughts on, it's going to veer from one side to the other, but right now, it's just sort of foundational, like the Inquisition. The powerful people know, and if you're not with that, you're canceled. So what are your thoughts on those areas, and does it rate against the problem you're trying to solve?
Well, power is where the money is. We live in a capitalist world, and there are 1% of the human population owns 50% of the human wealth. This is bizarre. And one of the features of the structure of feeling in the neoliberal period, 1980 to 2020, was taking that for granted. No, that's not bizarre. That's the way things are. There are super rich people, and there are, I think, 50% of the human population is doing 7% of the carbon emissions and has less than 1% of human wealth. That's 50% of humanity. So power is where the law supports and money can buy the people making the laws. We are in a power struggle. And science is the one actually making the toys, the food, the material basis of our life is being created by scientists, but they've got guns to their head, and they have to get their grant money. They have to do the science that gets funded, and they are not free to just follow the science they think does the best for humanity. They have to get funded like everybody else in this world. So we're in a wicked power struggle, and this is why I talk about a working political majority. If you could elect legislatures that put in intensely progressive taxation of individuals and of corporations, of income and of assets. Well, that'd be a little bit French, but it would be effective. And so it's the power struggle is going to be there. And science usually throws itself on the side of justice and of a reduction of suffering. This is the basic impulse behind the scientific enterprise. So, but the power struggle persists. So, and it's not over. We're in the 2020s may be exciting, but it's also going to be a very wicked and prolonged political battle that none of us will outlive it, really. There was a question up here at the front.
You have this feeling of hope, and yet you speak of the youth having their faces in their screens, and we have a whole political society now looking to control the bodies of our population and what they can do, and half of the population not believing in science. How can we beat this? How do we go forward?
Well, the working political majority, let's just say you're never going to convince everybody, but you need 51%. In certain situations, you need 55%. In certain bizarre situations, you need 60%. That's why I say a working political majority, whatever it might be. You got to win that. So it's a political organization, it's education, it's telling the stories, it's relying on a certain demographic, which I could just say old white men in America are going to die. And the demographic turn is going to bring in a much more diverse, younger, more feminist, more diverse crowd of voters. And so there has to be a political party that appeals to at least 55% of the population and then keeps on ramming through legislation. So I'm only hopeful in the sense that we're in a fight when people know what their own material interests are and their own moral interests are, then they're going to do the right thing. So then you just have to spread the story and hope that that story wins enough. You can never hope for universal acclaim. That's something I know very personally. But you can hope for a working political majority. And really, this is the way we're going to be in a decade of continuous defeats. And so it'll be like the American Revolution. Lose, 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 win. Well, where'd that win come from? Persistence and luck and doing the right things and getting that working political majority. But if you look at the history of the American Revolution, you're thinking, how did Yorktown happen again? And you can't make it make sense except for all these other factors. So struggle on. I mean, I feel, see, I hope, what is, there can be angry hope. There can be hope that you use as a club to beat your opponents with. Things could be better, therefore everybody ought to be trying to make them better. So I'm going to beat you with that.
Angry hope. I really like that.
Susan, we're getting long on time, but there's one question. I wanted to invite a virtual attendee. So some folks are posting questions online. So this is just, maybe we'll make this our last one from a virtual guest. So Ministry for the Future does get to a relative utopia through significant reduction in human population. Is that a correct reading of the book? Is it possible to get to a better world without it?
Oh, well, I don't think that's quite right. The ministry dodges the population question and basically assumes that we kind of hold steady at 8 billion, that there isn't a huge jump. If I recall right, it's not even a factor in the novel because we are stuck with 8 billion people. And this is so controversial a topic. It's a strange one to end on, but I think I can shape it correctly. The more power women have in the world, the less human population is a problem because the replacement rate will go with, like, if we wanted the human population to stay steady on the planet, it would be 2.2 kids per mom. And I really want to write a science fiction story about that 0.2 of a kid. Like they'd be really short, you know, or slender. But when women have their full set of legal rights, and I'm not talking just about reproductive rights, but I'm talking about property rights and marriage rights and the whole and educational rights, then the replacement rate, the growth rate is usually about 1.8, 1.7. You see this all across the world. You see also demographic turns, like in Thailand or in Indonesia. They changed the laws. Women had immensely more power. Went from 5 kids per mom to 2 kids per mom in a single 10-year period. So the more power women have, the better off the human population situation gets. This is a double good because human rights are human rights and everybody should have them equally. And then also, if the populations, I've written about this before, if it goes down naturally because of individual choices by individual citizens, the family choices, and it goes down over the next century or so, that will ease the burden on the biosphere. And every young person will be treasured and there will be full employment, and it'll be very utopian to have a voluntary reduction in human population. And I may have gestured at that in Ministry for the Future, but to tell you the truth, I don't remember that being a feature of that book.
Great. Can we have a round of applause?
Thank you so much, Stan.
Is this on? Yes. Yeah. I can't help but think of the great trenching and this college in 1972 and imagining the bridge to Trenton not being there and the utopia that we tried to create
Oh,
here
yeah.
in 1972 versus where we are now, where we don't have that ability to make a trench. Anyway, that's one thought. Secondly, Stan's book, Ministry for the Future, is available. Hopefully you'll stick around and
Yeah,
sign a few.
I brought
And
my
it's-
sign and pen.
Yeah, as much as I want you to read that book, and I agree, it's a great book. I hope it provides a window to Stan's other books, because one of the great things we didn't talk about today that I think you would agree with is the power of art to shape the world also. And in 2312, which is what I'm reading and one of my favorites so far, we're looking at Marina Abramovich and Andy Goldsworthy as being kind of two inspirations for a heroine who is helping transform the solar system, and really interesting to look at that too. So let this be a window into Stan's wider world. And thank you both very, very much for being here. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. I'm gonna-